Hi everyone, I'm Barry. Thank you so much for Roshi and the rest of you inviting me to talk today. I appreciate being here. A little bit about myself. I'm a been practicing Zen off and on, mostly on for about I'd say probably over 30 years at this point, which is kind of sobering. That means I'm getting old. I started practicing. I was probably 19 or so. I kind of went and saw the Grateful Dead and did kind of Grateful Dead oriented activities and experienced some just tremendously eye-opening experiences. And and these experiences led me to really see that there was more to reality in life than kind of what I experienced at that one point. And most importantly, it was very clear that these were pointing towards a path of like healing and liberation. So, in many ways, I felt like, that this is why we're here to kind of figure this out. And that kind of led to really a life kind of dedicated to discovering this path. I lived in a monastery for about a year, a Soto Zen monastery, which was interesting. Um, but the best part of it was, we just did lots of sitting, lots of zazen, and so pretty early in my life, I got a lot of those kind of neurological grooves of being able to sit deeply, kind of ingrained, and it's been really beneficial to my practice over the years. But other than that, most of my practice has been, essentially as a layperson, a householder is probably a better way to state it. Working, having a family, all while doing a practice. My practice probably was weakest when I had babies and toddlers. I was just so overwhelmed. I went a couple years with not sitting that much. But with practice, once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't really put it back in. I've never, even during that period where I wasn't sitting that much, practice was still the major filter through which I saw life and so forth. So I've gotten um, permission to teach Zen through the Clear Minds Zen path, which is Soto, and then seeing myself as always a student. I never want to not be a Zen student, never not have a teacher. I continued my studies through Russell Mitchell, where I'm doing koans. I actually started doing koans kind of. I didn't have like a great desire to do it, but I was a Dharma brother of Russell, and he had gotten permission to teach koans, and I'm like, oh, that might be interesting. So I went into it with very low expectations and not much, energy. But it's really been amazing. It very much transformed my practice in a lot of ways that I never expected. And I've received preliminary permission to teach koans after a couple of years of practice, or I guess a number of years of practice. And that's really overdrive my experience with koans. The old adage, you know, if you want to learn something, teach it. And actually guiding a few people through koans has really deepened my experience of the koans themselves. So I'm really appreciative of that. And I'm appreciative of Roshi's approach of, having a long apprenticeship and being a teacher. I think it's a really great process that other Zen lineages could make use of. Anyway, so that's me. Oh, and I also have a, a podcast called Simplicity Zen, where I interview various Zen teachers. I've interviewed some of the people here on this talk today. So check that out if you're interested. But anyway, so my talk today is on the five aggregates. It's pretty much my favorite topic regarding Buddhism. And I really dived into it when I started getting interested in the kind of the neural correlates of suffering and practice, looking at practice from a neurological perspective. And in order to make sense of that information, I had to really dive deep and get a better understanding of kind of what we could call early Buddhism or core Buddhism, the Buddhism found in the early Pali Sutras, and really even a subset of those, I think, can be considered the core Buddhism. And as I studied those, I really saw the centrality of the five aggregates in the Buddha's philosophy and his teachings. And in learning of those with the kind of alongside the neurobiology, it kind of really crystallized to me how they worked. And so I want to kind of give a brief overview of my understanding of them. So the first way I encountered the five aggregates, like I think most people who practice Zen, is through the Heart Sutra. And the text is Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing prajna paramita, clearly saw that all five aggregates are empty and thus relieved all suffering. That's the San Francisco Zen Center's translation of the Heart Sutra. Various groups translated slightly different ways, but that's the basis of it. And I'm going to loop back around to this at the end and talk about how seeing that the five aggregates are empty does relieve suffering. So the other place where you commonly encountered the five aggregates is with the first noble truth of the Four Noble Truths. And here's the text for this. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of dissatisfaction. Birth is dissatisfaction, aging is dissatisfaction, illness is dissatisfaction, death is dissatisfaction, union with what is displeasing is dissatisfaction, separating from what is pleasing is dissatisfaction. Not getting what we want, not getting what one wants is dissatisfaction. In brief, the five aggregates of grasping are dissatisfaction. So this translator uses dissatisfaction to translate dukkha. More often it's translated as suffering, and I'll probably say suffering throughout this talk, just kind of as a habit. But I do like dissatisfaction as a translation for dukkha, because it kind of, I think, better encompasses the wide range of dukkha type experiences. Like suffering kind of implies like intense and intensity, but suffering can be very subtle, like, standing in line at the grocery store and not wanting to be there. That's a very subtle form of dukkha, that maybe is kind of missed by, the strong term of suffering. But I'll probably say suffering just because it's a habit as I go through this talk. So let's look at the individual five aggregates. First, I'm going to talk about their common translation. So there's rupa, which is form, vedana, which is sensations, samjna, which is perceptions, samskara, which is formations, and vijnana, which is consciousness. So those are the more often than not, those will be the translations that you see, especially in kind of a Mahayana Zen context. But so I'm going to give slightly different translations that I think better define them a little bit in the context in which we'll talk about them in. And part of it is a lot of these kind of Pali and Sanskrit terms, they don't have one English word that really translate them. And a lot of times you need kind of compound terms to really translate what's being hinted at. So I'll give my translations. So rupa, I translate as the body. Vedana is hedonic tone. So hedonic is kind of a philosophical or scientific word that means the either, and we'll get to this, pleasant or negative, right? It really kind of breaks down to that binary sense of it either is pleasant or it's negative, and there's a tone to that. It's hedonic. Hedonic means feeling. So I like to use hedonic tone. Samjana, instead of just perception, I like to call it perception and categorization, and I'll explain why. Samskara is motivated decision making. I think you kind of need all three of those words to really kind of sum them up. And Vijnana, dualistic consciousness instead of just consciousness. And again, I'll justify that translation later. So let's look at them individually. Actually, before looking at them individually, let's look at other ways that the Buddha kind of references the five aggregates throughout the sutras. Often he'll equate them with the concept of name and form. Name being the aggregates that aren't the body, and then form being the body. So these brought together, he'll often say name and form, kind of as a synonym for the five aggregates. He also equates them with self-identity. And I'll quote from one sutra here. It's the Sama Nupassana Sutta. I think it's the Being Sutra or something like that. I didn't write down the translation here, but I think it's like the Being Sutra. So he says, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but a person who has not awakened regards body as self, the self as having a body, the body as being in the self, or the self as being the body. And then he goes on and says that for all, all the five aggregates. For example, he says, a person who is not awakened regards the perceptions as the self as the self as having perceptions, perceptions as being in the self, or the self as being in the perception. So he's saying that like an unawakened point of view is to see any of the aggregates as being in the self, comprising the self, or the self being in them. And then he says, so this way of regarding arises. It occurs to a non-awakened person to think I am. So he's equating the five aggregates as a sense of self-identity. And also he's making it clear that the self-identity is not really ourself. And we'll get to that later too. So why do the five aggregates exist? I mean, they basically exist for decision making, for surviving in the world. The five aggregate process, and a lot of times the five aggregates are defined as nouns, a thing, but really the five aggregates are a process. It's an activity. That could be a talk in itself, why it's more of an activity than a thing. But and understanding that, I think, also clears up a lot of kind of strange beliefs some people have about Buddhism. But so the five aggregates are really about survival. The five aggregates are a brain-based activity, and the only living things that have brains are creatures that need to move around and interact with the world. Like if you're just sitting there and being a tree or whatever, tree in the cypress garden, sucking up sun and water, you're not moving, so you don't need a brain. So it's only creatures that move around need brains. And in fact, there's this one creature that, some sort of like aquatic worm or something, the first phase of its life, it swims around the ocean and it needs a brain to interact and move. But then it plants itself at one point on a rock. And at that point, it actually digests its own brain because it doesn't need a brain anymore because it's not moving, right? So brains and decision, and processing information, it's all about decision making. And interestingly, this isn't just a kind of a modern interpretation of it. The Buddha actually kind of says this kind of explicitly. So one of the sutras is the Athi Raga Sutta, and it's translated as "Where There Is Passion" Sutra. And he says we need. So in this, to kind of paraphrase some parts of it, he says we need nutrients to survive, and defines I think 4 different types of nutrients. But one of the nutrients he defines is food, and so regarding survival and self-identity, the Buddha says, if there is desire, relishing, or craving for food, vijnana, which is dualistic consciousness, becomes established there and grows. Where vijnana is established and grows, name and form, aka self-identity or the five aggregates, are conceived. So he's equating here explicitly the five aggregates with obtaining, craving for and obtaining food. And as we'll see, to obtain something, you have to make there's decision making involved. So now let's look at the individual aggregates. The first one, rupa, the body. As we said, it's often translated as form, but in the context, form is an accurate translation when you're talking about rupa in the greater sense. But when you're talking about the five aggregates, it really is talking about the body. So it's our physical being. And the important part here is our body, even if there's no, like self-referential thinking going on, it has a drive to survive. It has this basic drive to exist as an entity, and for most people to make new entities, make a new generation. And even if you don't have offspring yourself, you're still part of society that's creating a framework for the next generation to survive. So the kind of the core drives of being a body is to survive and help the next generation survive. So it's just a fundamental drive of being a living being. The next aggregate is Vedana, feeling tones. It's often translated as feelings or sensations. I like to call it motivated motivated feelings, um, or yeah, motivated feelings. And there's really three flavors, technically speaking, from a Buddhist perspective. There's pleasant, neutral, and unpleasant. And what they are is they're basically real-time rewards and punishments, um, that the body gives us to motivate us to do things that help us survive. Um, since the nature doesn't want us to kind of just be pre-programmed and not analyze and make decisions, it allows us to make decisions, but it wants us to do it with guardrails. It wants it, and those guardrails are the rewards and punishments of what the body thinks we need to do to survive. For example, eating is important for survival, so we're rewarded with pleasure when we're eating. Usually, it's context is dependent, or if our hands in fire, that's unpleasant, that's bad for survival, so we're given a punishment, and so it's a real-time motivator to do something new. It's the basic currency of survival. The next aggregate is samjna, often just translated as perception, but it's not just raw perception, it's perception and categorization. So raw perception, we could say, is absolute reality, the reality of this moment. But samjana is a bit more abstract. What it is, it's a layer of filtering and abstraction on top of absolute reality, where we name things, we categorize things, we and very importantly, we kind of assign a mapping of the name of our understanding of something to its underlying hedonic tone. You can think of, we have like a database inside of our subconscious of mapping phenomena and objects in the world to feeling tones. And as we go through life, we learn more and more about and update this database. A lot of times this database is erroneous. For example, very early in life, I had wonderful dim sum. And so like internally, my brain says like, dim sum is amazing. But the reality is most dim sum I get is gross and fatty and salty. But it's, for some reason, that database is not updated correctly. And I'm often wasting time eating gross dim sum. So is life. But this kind of abstraction is important, because we can't go through life kind of analyzing everything in the greatest detail. Like, I have this can of sparkling water. Like, I can't be like, oh, it's shiny, it's spherical, seems to be some liquid. Like if I had to analyze deeply everything I experienced in minute detail, I would never even get out of bed. I'd be like, what? There's something on me, it's keeping me warm. But so we have these really quick abstractions of reality, and they help us survive. It's important. Um, um, but we'll see there's some limitations of it. So just to sum up at this point, we have a body that gives us motivation to survive. We have feeling tones, which are rewards and punishments that the body gives us to motivate survival. And now we're able to perceive the world and kind of categorize it, name it, and so forth, and assign feeling tone values to it. And so bringing this all together, we get to the next aggregate, which is samskara. So it's often translated as formations, which is technically correct, but kind of a horrible translation because it doesn't really tell you what's going on. More modern sutra translators, they'll use intention or choices. I kind of like decision making because it emphasizes the process oriented aspect of it. It's not just the result of the process; it's actually the process itself, and that's an important distinction that I'll get to. And I also like to throw motivated in there because it really is, you're being motivated, and I'll explain that here in a second. So so as we go through life, interacting with the world, making decisions, it's really important to understand that it's not done in isolation. It's not pure logic where you're just like a computer analyzing the world, deciding how best to do things. Underwriting all of this is is feelings. So decision making is always feeling based, even if we're making logical decisions, at least subconsciously and sometimes even consciously. What we're doing is we're we're creating like abstractions, like simulations of the future. And what we're doing is when we get to the end of a certain simulation branch, we realize, oh, that would feel good. Or we get to another one and that would feel bad. For example, like I recently had to decide whether to go back to school. And so what I did is my brain did is it did a whole bunch of calculations and figure like what happens if I don't go back to school? Ooh, that could be bad. That would feel bad. And then I did another simulation and figured out what I would do if I went back to school. And I said, well, there'd be some bad stuff, but ultimately it would be good. And so I ultimately came to the decision to go back to college at 51 years old, because ultimately my brain decided like, well, that'll feel, of all the options, that will ultimately have the best chance of feeling good. So like it's, um, most people who don't practice, they're really, or maybe not going to really great therapy, are really completely blind to how much feelings and emotions drive our decision-making process. It's really incredible. When you practice and you pay attention, it becomes a lot more obvious. Um, but but most people are kind of blind to it, strangely enough. Some other aspects of this motivated decision making, it's self-referential, or at least the type of decision making that's important to Buddhism. It's very much like, what's in it for me, or what is this perspective from my, what is the situation from my perspective? It's very of a self-referential activity. Um, it's also very future based, as I mentioned. You're constantly running simulations of the future to determine potential feeling tone outcomes. It's heavily driven by conceptualizations. It has like a schematic database of their beliefs about the world, which again isn't necessary because we can't analyze everything in minute detail. So having a kind of high level schematic model of the world is really helpful. For example, part of my schema is Zen is good for me, or Zen is good for other people. And so, so that's kind of a filter through which I process reality and also make my decisions. Another aspect of this is getting under the hood a little bit. It's extremely dopamine driven. Dopamine is the brain chemical that kind of gives us motivation and is a very future oriented process. So, so decision making is a future oriented, conceptualized, time traveling decision making process. So all underwritten and driven by optimizing feeling tones. All right, so the last aggregate here is Vijnana, often translated as consciousness. Um, I, um, I like to translate it kind of more precisely as what it really means is dualistic consciousness. If we look at the word vi, means separated or split or divided, and jnana means consciousness or awareness. So it's split consciousness. It's so it's the precognitive sense of being an object in a world of objects. Even being even our thoughts are seen as objects, as separate from us. Like we can't have thoughts, right? Thoughts are thinking is the sixth sense. There's six senses. There's six types of vijnana, each one for each of the senses. And it's kind of it's the context. It's usually given last in the list of aggregates because it's the context in which all the other aggregates operate. So the Buddha equated the five aggregates with self-identity, and let's talk a little bit about that. The reason is that, the reason self-identity is so important is most of the five aggregates are a decision-making process. And most of the decisions we make as humans are social ones. Who do we trust? Who do we not trust? To what group do we belong with? Who's our competitors? What value do we provide to a group? Most of our, people who really pay attention, they notice that a really high percentage of the thoughts that go through their brain are social in nature in this respect. And the Buddha saying the five aggregates of self-identity. So to make decisions, you have to have a self. You have to have a sense of who you are, what you believe, what you need, how do you fit in, and so forth. And so that's kind of where the self-identity aspect fits into the five aggregates. So having defined the five aggregates, let's talk a little bit about how they lead to suffering. If you go back to the formal definition of it, um, in the first Noble Truth, it was called the five aggregates of grasping, or clinging. It's not just the five aggregates by themselves; it's the five aggregates of grasping. And so, but before we look at grasping, we kind of have to look at the precursors to grasping, which are chanda and tanha, excuse me. And those are translated as desire and craving. And we'll look at chanda, or desire, first. So desires are basically, what it sounds like. It's something you want. It's an expectation you have. It's a goal that you have. They're very driven by dopamine again. They're you feel motivated to get them. People without dopamine don't feel motivation. Um, you know, um, a lot of times when people have dementia, they have dopamine. They're lacking their dopamine, and they really have a hard time. Sometimes for some people have a really hard time just feeling motivated. Um, but so Chanda is motivated, and despite what a lot of I think people with a kind of a kind of surface level understanding of Buddhism, they think all desires are bad. But the Buddha was very clear that desires in and of themselves are not bad. And in fact, the Buddha lists many desires which are wholesome, such as bodhicitta. And more mundanely, we can think of like the desire to, my desire to drive my kid to school. That's not a bad desire. That's it's a wholesome desire. My desire to help people. It's a good desire. My desire to be healthy. It's a good desire. So desires are not inherently bad. Um, and really taking a step back, so far the aggregates themselves are not inherently bad at all, even though they ultimately lead to suffering. They're not inherently bad. We need the aggregates. We need to make decisions to survive. It's just when the process goes wrong, and I'll talk about how the process goes wrong in a second. That's when there's problems. But the aggregates themselves are not inherently bad. I mean, they help us survive. And we even need the result desiring that they produce. But they can lead to suffering, and I'll talk about that pathway that leads to it. And the first step of the pathway leading to suffering is tanha, or craving. And so I made the distinction between desire and craving. So chanda, or desire, is simply wanting things, being motivated, having goals and so forth, having expectations. Tanha becomes, or excuse me, chanda, or desire, becomes craving, or tanha, when another ingredient gets added, and that ingredient is what is the Buddhist word is asavas, and asavas are often translated as taints, and the taint is a negative, disappointed emotion, right? And so you can have a desire, to drive, so I'll have the desire to drive my kid to school, but then let's say, a tree falls down on the road and that desire is blocked, and then I'll feel disappointment. And so that's where the taint enters the picture. It's the negative emotion tied to a blocked goal. Um, and if you really want to be precise about this, at that moment where you have the tainted desire that becomes craving, even that is not totally a problem, because fleeting disappointments are fine. And in fact, they're unavoidable. The second the tree crashed down on the road and I couldn't take my kid to school, I'm be like, oh, really? Like that's a reasonable, a reasonable result of that scenario. Or, if let's say I apply for a job and I really wanted this job and I find out I didn't get it, like, oh, really? Oh, that sucks. Okay. Again, that's not really a problem. It's just something that kind of entered into and then out of consciousness. Um, but once it's out of consciousness, it's fine. Once it's out of awareness, it's fine. It was just a fleeting thing that went through, and then I'm back to life and things are fine. Where the human problem is, and what we so often do is we grasp the scenario, like we hold on to it, and that's kind of where we come to the end of the definition of the five aggregates of grasping or clinging. And this is upadana, which is a Sanskrit and Pali term to mean to pick up. It kind of has dual meaning. One of the meanings is to take up, to pick up, and the other meaning is fuel, right? And so when you look at these together, what it is, it's a process, an ongoing activity that fuels that, you're taking up this fuel, and and that's energizing a process. And what that process is it's repetitive negative thinking. And really, and this is kind of where the rubber hits the road. Negative thinking is what actually causes suffering, and how this works in the brain is really interesting. But it's just having a desire is not a problem. Just being kind of momentarily, having a brief like, oh, that sucks, but then going back to life is not a problem. It's when we hold on to our expectations, or more precisely, our failed expectations, and ruminate on them or worry about them, is where the actual suffering comes. This is it's the activity of grasping or clinging, upadana. And there's kind of two major species of it. There's kind of where you're worrying about things, or you're ruminating about things in the past, and that's rumination, or it's more future oriented, that's worry. These are kind of the two themes of upadana, ongoing graspings. Again, if you're disappointed in something and it just floats in and out of consciousness, that's fine. But if you pick it up and you hold about it, and you kind of have this repetitive negative thinking, that's where the humans get caught in suffering, and that kind of completes that loop. So let's see what we have here. So why do people kind of ruminate? And if you look at how humans kind of cognate, so the five aggregate system, and specific samskara, or decision making, it's constantly running future simulations and seeing seeing the end path of a branching decision making process, and what's going to feel like if you get there. And it's and where we run into trouble, and where we start ruminating, is where we run all the branches, and every resulting branch results in a negative feeling. And the way kind of the mind defines successful decision making is when it runs simulations and is able to find one that results in a good feeling. And so when you are running all these simulations and you can't see a clear path to success for your goals, or even being able to define a successful goal, that's where we really start ruminating. Because humans are very, we're designed to have, being very adverse to uncertainty, and people actually vary in their degree of uncertainty and tolerance, but everyone has it to some degree, and it's the source of rumination. Okay, so what's the solution to this? This is a very advanced group of Zen practitioners, so I'm not going to be telling people here anything that we don't already know, but just to kind of sum it up, the basic solution to this, and the Buddha explains it many times, is the not self doctrine. The experience of not self. And going back to this sutra we quoted earlier, a person who has not awakened regards the aggregates as the self as having the aggregates as being in the self, or the self as being in the aggregates. And the way I kind of like to make an analogy for this is, so let's imagine there's the subconscious, which is completely opaque. We have no access to it. And I define we in this context as our present moment awareness, our present moment consciousness. Our present moment consciousness has no direct access to the subconscious. We can't get in there and see its workings. We can see the results of its workings, but we don't have direct conscious control or awareness of it. And so I like to think of it as this like black, opaque wall with this little hatch, or little doorway that comes out of it, and then the conveyor belt coming out. And so all these packages are going down the conveyor belt, and these packages are basically goals and expectations. Some of them, so they're going by, and this one, let's say, this goal is I need to brush my teeth. There's not a lot of hedonic tone implications of this, so we're not really paying too much attention to it. So it goes in and out of consciousness. And another one comes along. I really want to get this job, but let's say we get the job, and so great, we got the job, yay! And so we don't have to really worry about this package anymore. So it just goes down the conveyor belt out of consciousness. But then let's say another package comes down the conveyor belt, and it's like, let's say this one is I want to be healthy, and and there's a lot of feeling tone weight behind the I want to be healthy package, goal package that came out of the subconscious down this conveyor belt. But let's say we get a call from the doctor and says, you know what, those tests you took, come in, let's talk about those. Then that package starts kind of like flashing red, and we start thinking like, well, oh my God, let's say that this is, the worst comes to true, and I have, I don't know, long finger syndrome. I can't figure out a path to fixing my long finger syndrome. Like, what do I do? And so since the brain can't find a solution to fixing my long finger syndrome, it's going to start ruminating and going, and it basically it's the decision-making process going haywire and unable to complete itself because it can't see a successful goal to completion. There's too much uncertainty. And so basically, if the problem is picking up the package and grasping to it and holding on to it, what's the solution? And as Zen practitioners, we know what the solution is, and that's present moment awareness. It's being embedded in absolute reality, because as it turns out, absolute reality. Well, take a step back. We've seen how like the five aggregates, future-oriented cognition, self-referential cognition, self-identity, craving, grasping, they're all kind of one entity. They're all the five aggregate system itself. And as it turns out, the self system or the five aggregate system, it's actually anti-core present moment awareness, at the brain level. This is a lot of the brain science I've looked into. This is in a lot of ways the most fascinating part, is since they're anti-correlated, when present moment awareness is dominant in our consciousness, the five aggregate system gets quieted down. And and if you're doing something, like if you're just completely engrossed in something, it actually goes away. And in the mundane way to think about this, like if you go see a fascinating movie, during the movie you're not thinking about yourself at all. You're just completely engrossed in the movie, and then you walk out and you're like, oh my God, I was completely lost in that movie. I wasn't there. I was just the movie. So that's a very mundane example of this process. And conversely, if the five aggregate system and it's all that's ruminating is dominant, you're more into the time traveling mode of cognition, and you're kind of not paying attention to the future. And so they're very anti-correlated. And so the very simple the very simple conclusion of this is the more that we're embedded and kind of live from present moment awareness, the more we're not slaves to the five aggregate system. It's still available to us as a tool. Like, if I have to decide what to do for the rest of my day, the five aggregate system can bubble up and make decisions. But if I'm anchored in present moment reality, I'm less likely to spin out of control in upadana or grasping driven rumination when I can't figure out what to do. I'm able to come back and reside in the present moment, more comfortably, and I'm no longer a slave to the five aggregate system. And in my own life, I have various levels of success of that, but certainly over the years, by lived experiences, I'm much more able to just abide in the present moment, and I'm a lot less likely to get lost in craving and grasping rumination, repetitive negative thinking. And when I do, I'm much more able to catch it and come back to the present. So kind of bringing it full circle, going back to the Heart Sutra, it says, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing prajnaparamita, clearly saw that all five aggregates are empty and thus relieved all suffering. And that's the basic process there. Because emptiness is the perception of absolute reality just as it is without the filter of the five aggregates. So the solution to clinging driven suffering is absolute reality, the emptiness of the present moment. All right, so that's my presentation. If anyone has any complaints, this would be the time to lodge them.